This interview is sponsored by the James J. Blanchard Living Library for the Michigan Political History Society. I'm John Lindstrom, and we're interviewing today Doug Roberts, a man who is best known as playing a leading role in Michigan's finance and economic development over the last almost half century, and who, if things had gone a little bit differently, might have been remembered as a world champion duckpin bowler. You were on the circuit for a very brief time as a young man, weren't you?
John, thank you, and I'm glad the opportunity. And yes, when I was in college, I was technically a professional bowler. Now, at that time, the rules for the NCAA were that if you accepted any money in any sport, you were finished. So I could not compete in college. Duckpin bowling was in the East Coast where I grew up. It is the same size alley, but it's a very small ball. It's 3 pounds, 10 ounces. And I went to a number of tournaments all summer long. And at the end of the summer, I decided going back to college was a wiser choice.
And you started in college at the University of Maryland.
University of Maryland, that's correct.
Yes, and you were studying chemistry originally.
That is correct.
And so what led you to study economics instead?
The truth of the matter is that I went to the University of Maryland and I was majoring in chemistry, and my second semester of my freshman year, I flunked out of chemistry. I didn't have bad grades outside of chemistry, so I ran over to the business school and took a number of business classes, and economics just came very easy.
And after you graduated from Maryland, you decided to go on with your education. What brought you to Michigan State?
I applied to 5 universities, and I applied to the doctoral program in economics. One university offered me money. That was Michigan State. So one could technically probably say for $300 a month for 9 months, I got bought. But I got in-state tuition. I was newly married. I lived in Spartan Village. And so I was very pleased with the opportunity to come here.
And instead of getting into things like finance and some of the more theoretical aspects of economics, you seem to be interested right off the bat with public finance.
I did. My major right away was public finance. It was called state and local finance. And I ultimately not only got my doctorate in that, but I wrote my thesis on state taxes in Michigan. And so, I mean, I really had a background in taxes from the very beginning.
Probably a good thing you were already married. I can't imagine writing about state taxes would have been a big pickup line in a bar.
I tend to think that's probably true. But yes, I was very fortunate. I was married to a delightful lady.
And having gotten your doctorate in looking at state finances, is that why you chose then to look at working in public service?
I went into public service primarily because that was the history of my family. So if you don't mind, I'd like to go back just a little bit. I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., in a Maryland suburb. My father was a member of the United States Secret Service. He protected 5 presidents. He was with President Kennedy when he was assassinated. It was a big deal, and that's a story for another day. But public service was a big deal in my family. So when I was getting my doctorate at MSU, ironically, the two sort of went together, because I did not finish my doctorate and go to work. I finished all my exams, and I'm writing my doctorate, my thesis, and I got to work for a gentleman by the name of George Montgomery. So I was working for Representative George Montgomery, who was chair of the House Taxation Committee, and that's when I finished my thesis.
And George Montgomery, obviously many people will not remember that name or know that name, but he was a legend in his own time, not just in his own mind, but in his own time. And he was a really amazing kind of a character, wouldn't you say?
George Montgomery was wonderful, and he treated me so extraordinary. I'm not sure that I fully appreciate it when you're very young and you have somebody who literally says, I'm going to be your mentor without you asking. And he was. He knew an awful lot about taxes. He was not educated in taxes. He was out of the 5th District of Detroit. He was chair of the Taxation Committee, and he taught me a great deal in terms of how taxes work, who the players were in taxes, and so I can't say how much I enjoyed it. There are 2 stories that I'd like to tell about George Montgomery, in addition to all the things that we worked on that when I worked for him for 5 years. But the first story deals with a completely different world from the world we live in right now, completely different. At that time, chair of committees were very, very important. You could hardly get an amendment on a bill on the floor without going through the chair. If the chair opposed, the majority party would vote it down. So I remember sitting next to him, again, a very young person, and a representative comes up to Mr. Montgomery, is what I called him, and said to the chairman, he said, would you put this amendment on the bill that's coming up? George read the bill. He looked at the legislator and said, if I put the amendment on, will you vote for the bill? And the guy said, no. George looked at the amendment and says, yeah, I'll put it on. Of course, I'm sitting here thinking, this wasn't any book I learned. So after the guy left, I looked at Mr. Montgomery and I said, what was that all about? He said, when a gentleman asks you to do something and then has the ability to say no, his word is good. I can deal with this person. I'll get his vote on something else later. That's a completely different world from what we live in right now. So, I mean, I learned a lot in terms of long-term thinking past it. I also learned about the issue, how you win is as important sometimes as how you lose. Because tomorrow in government is another day. And you have to sometimes think about tomorrow. And regrettably, I don't think that happens very much today. Let me just continue with Representative Montgomery for just a little longer. While I had the privilege of working for him, we worked on things that people forget all about. One of them was called the single business tax. 1975, we adopted the single business tax. I was a big supporter of it. I was one of the very few legislative staff who understood it and was asked to explain it all over the place, and which I did. It was adopted. And in 2006, it was repealed. So that's my legacy on that one. But we also adopted other bills. The homestead property tax credit. And people have been using it for, 40 years. We adopted that at the same time, 1974. There's another bill called the Plant Rehabilitation District, PA 198 in 1974. We adopted that. I had the opportunity to be on the ground floor of a number of really remarkable achievements in government, and I was very proud of that.
And I don't want to gloss over those because each one of those was incredibly dramatic to the state finance system as well as to economic development. You talk about, for example, the single business tax. That was a really, really difficult vote to go through, was it not?
No, it was very difficult.
And because, explain a little bit what was involved here. You were taking, 6 separate taxes that affected businesses?
That's correct.
And turning it all into one, which on the surface sounds like maybe that's a good idea. But it was incredibly controversial.
It was. And the reason is because the whole country of the United States, even to this day, is very used to the issue of the income tax, either for individuals or for corporations, a corporation income tax. And that's what Michigan had. Michigan had a corporation income tax. It had a financial institution income tax. It had what was called an inventory tax, which was a property tax that applied only on one day on your inventory. We had all sorts of taxes that applied. And so what this proposal was to basically go off the income tax approach and go to we argued, a much more stable approach, which is a very large base and a very small rate. Let me just continue something. The history of Michigan is a roller coaster in terms of the economy. We have been going up and down. The changes in the individual income tax from year to year was like 20 and 30%. You can't write a budget when you have that sort of changes year to year. So the idea was, let's have a little bit more stability, a little less fluctuation, and then that will ultimately be a better system. It was incredibly controversial, and frankly, I really, to this day, I will just say it, it had a one-time benefit because of the way it was structured to the budget of something like $100 million. Today, $100 million is, who's all that excited? That was a big number then. And that meant you didn't have to either raise other taxes or you didn't have to cut the budget. So I think that played a bigger role than some of us will. It wasn't all, this is absolutely a better tax. I believe that, but I believe a lot of votes were accomplished because it gave us a one-time benefit. But this was a base which people would look at and say, are you kidding me? It was you took all your wages and salaries, you took your depreciation, you took the interest paid and your profits, and you added them up and applied a very small number rate. The argument is it was a tax basically on size. A bigger company paid more taxes, A smaller company paid less taxes. It wasn't, even though profits was included, it wasn't a profits tax. It was a much more stable tax for Michigan, and I think for a long time served Michigan well in that
You also
capacity.
had a number of businesses who, to some degree, have been exempt from an awful lot of those other taxes. I remember the hotel industry, for example.
The ones who really hit us hard were service industries. And one of the reasons that I think the single business tax got off to a bad foot is the businesses that got hit and their taxes did go up were something called accountants. They're the ones that did the taxes. So when somebody would come in and saying, you don't know how bad this tax is, they made sure to point out anything that was a negative in the tax that the business may not have liked. So, but also, doctors, even my own dentist decided he didn't like the tax because it raised his individual tax. So
did he do any extra drilling on you?
I don't know, but I didn't argue with him until it was over. I will say that.
And you talked about PA 198. We hear an awful lot these days in Michigan, but in other states as well, about businesses getting tax breaks, specific tax breaks to do developments. PA 198 was one of the first.
Yes, it was.
To attempt that and by giving businesses a tax break for locating, as I recall, mostly in cities.
No, it was any place locally. It may have started out, but it was any place that the local government wanted to grant it. And so PA 198 is a tax abatement, and it was, I know this sounds very strange because I'm not an attorney, but I did work hard in taxes. I did work hard in tax law. In some cases, the tax is a 50% cut. 50% of what? 50% of the value. It isn't a 50% cut in mills. And why is this important? Because I believed, and then I remember writing a memo about this particular act and saying it'll never hold up in court because the Constitution said that property taxes must be uniform. Well, this is 2018. It clearly is held up in court. So that's the reason I'm an economist and not an attorney.
Huh. And then you talked about the homestead tax exemption. Now, one of the big issues that has driven the state for a long time, politically as well as economically, is Michigan's property taxes.
That's correct.
And the homestead tax credit was a very dramatic decrease for many, many people in their property taxes. And it was really the first time the state tried to come up with something to help cut property taxes.
No question about it. It was a direct result of the first attempt to change school finance reform and property taxes, which occurred in 1972. When that attempt failed, and I'd like to come back to that later if we have time, but when that attempt failed, then the legislature said we have to address property tax even if we can't address school finance. And so what they did is they literally tied property taxes to income. This was a brand new concept. So they basically said that if your property taxes are too big, and how did they define too big? They said, are your property taxes greater than 3.5% of your household income? And if they were, the state would refund 60%. And for seniors, over and above a certain amount, it was 100% reimbursement. So this was a very important way of tying income and property taxes together, and ultimately was upheld as constitutional. But it was very new. And I think, again, you can agree or disagree, but the single business tax was the first one in the country for us. It's called a value-added tax, and I worked on that. The homestead property tax credit was one of the first in the country. So, I was part, even then, of some really dramatic changes. And again, I'm very proud of it, regardless of what other people think about it. What a neat thing to do to be able to work on such dramatic changes.
And the man that you worked for during the development of most of those concepts, Representative Montgomery, he died a few years after you stopped working for him.
That's correct.
And you and I were talking earlier, and something very touching to you.
It did, something very touching. I worked for George Montgomery for 5 years, and I left to go work for Governor Milliken. And while I'm working I'm the deputy budget director for the state under Governor Milliken, I get a call from then Speaker Bobby Krim, who I knew very well. And the speaker called me and said, Doug, I said, Mr. Speaker, he said, I'm calling you to tell you that Representative Montgomery passed away. And I said, thank you, Mr. Speaker, I already know that. And he said, but that's not the only reason I'm calling you. He said, I'm calling you to tell you that in George's will, he asked that you be one of his pallbearers along with his grandchildren. That was the first time I thought he thought a great deal of me to put me that request. Of course I did, and I was honored to do so.
And when you went to work for Governor Milliken in the budget department, the 1970s seemed to be a period of one recession punctuated by maybe a couple of years of good economic growth going into another recession, we were starting to see the change that it is still not quite resolved in Michigan's economy from a mostly manufacturing economy to something else. What was it like working at that time you worked with?
I had various jobs in the Department of Management budget when I went over there. And before I got into the budget piece, if you don't mind, I'd like to just get it on the record that for better or for worse, I was the very first director of the Office of State Employer. That is the office that now does negotiations. It was not meant for me, and I didn't last too long. But when I went on to become the deputy budget director under Jerry Miller, who was the director of management and budget, obviously appointed. They're appointed positions by Governor Milliken.
And someone who was known by reporters under the nickname of Dr. Strange Tax.
That's true, too, and that was primarily because of the single business tax. Because that's what, or Dr. No. He went under both titles. But he was an absolutely remarkable man, and I have several wonderful stories of both Jerry Miller and Governor Milliken, and maybe this is a good time to tell them. But before I go to that, I'd like to just say, your point about the economy going up and down was absolutely true. That's one of the arguments for adopting a single business tax. The economy was obviously dependent heavily on automobiles, so if the autos had a good year, we had a good year. If the autos didn't, the state didn't have a good year. And sometimes it was just very, very difficult to predict exactly what was happening. I've got so many statistics, but I want to give you just one. People think about the unemployment rate. How do I put this gently? Michigan's unemployment rate relative to the U.S. Was above, the Michigan unemployment rate was higher than the U.S. for like 30 straight years. Maybe it was 28, from 1966 almost up to 1992 or 93. I mean, we were always above. Now somebody says, well, we have a manufacturing economy. That's true. But even in good years, not all, that means every single year, good years and bad years, our unemployment rate. It was a very difficult time, and still, we dealt with it the best we could.
And you were talking about Jerry Miller. One of the things I remember during one of the recessions, one of the big recessions we had, the state was in such bad financial shape that a proposal was being worked on but never actually made that I understood that Dr. Miller looked at, and that was to basically shut half the restrooms in the Capitol complex to try to cut down on the costs of cleaning, soap, plumbing, and everything else. That sounds somewhat ridiculous, but it also was incredibly inventive.
Could be, and I was not part of it. So we had another deputy in Department of Management Budget, which was sort of head of all facilities. That may have been discussed. I was not in the room, and I can't comment on that. I do know that they tried to get rid of paper in the bathrooms to save paper towels and went to air dry, and that didn't go over real well either. So
doesn't that go to the point about you think of accounting and budgeting as rather dry subjects, but Jerry Miller was a really creative thinker in that regard, wasn't he?
Jerry Miller was wonderful. And let me just tell you a story. And I think it's a very instructive story. And the reason it is because it affected my life for the rest of it. I remember I'm the deputy budget director. I go in and I say, Jerry, we have a problem. I don't, to this day, don't even remember what the problem was. And he says, okay. I tell him, he said, yep, that's a problem. And he said, what's the solution? And I said, I don't know. And he didn't smile, he didn't look, he looked right at me and he said, I don't pay you to bring me problems. I pay you to bring me solutions. Now, he didn't have to agree with it, but from then on, and frankly, for the rest of my life, if I ever went to a governor, no matter what it was, if there was a problem, I had a proposed solution. They don't have to agree with it, but at least I went with something, and that did change the way I looked at the world. And so he worked very, very hard. You got to remember that Jerry Miller was, at least at that time of Bill Milliken's administration, remember, he was governor for 14 years. This is sort of the last part of the administration. Jerry Miller was the governor's go-to person, not just for budget. I mean, almost for anything that was going on. And so being the number two person meant that there was a lot of things that were going on, and it was even though it was a rough time, it was still an extremely exciting time. And, I'm just proud to have worked for somebody like Jerry Miller, and particularly proud to have worked for somebody like Governor Milliken. And if it's okay, I'd like to go in with
Please.
Bill Milliken. The time is January of 1982. It's Bill Milliken's last year. The economy is falling off the table. I don't mean declining. I mean it's falling off the table. Michigan is based on the auto industry, which at that time was Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors. They had a monopoly of the market in the United States. That sales of autos was not only falling, but the share of American cars was falling in addition. It's a double hit. We were getting creamed. So Jerry goes to the governor and says, we have to cut the budget. And the governor says, okay, and we had to issue an executive order. And so it was very tough. I won't go through all the details, but we passed it. That budget was cut. 5 or 6 weeks later, Jerry Miller goes to the governor and says, we have to do it again. Bill Milliken was an incredible individual, and it's a privilege to have known him, and particularly to work for him. He never, to my knowledge, yelled at somebody. He might. I never saw him. Anyway, he was very stern with Jerry, and he said, cut more than you need. I'm not doing this again. This is a real story. Some period of time later, we didn't have enough. We're going to have to cut one more time. And Jerry Miller is in Texas, and I have to go explain this to Bill Milliken. They set up his office so that the governor's desk it was at one end of the room, and my chair was right in front, just me. And then his staff was off to the side. And it was a very difficult, do people really know what you're doing? I felt terrible. I felt that we had let such a good person down. I really felt awful. And it was very clear, it was written all over me, that I just felt terrible. And so the meeting was over, we had our orders, I was going back. And Governor Milliken comes up to me and he puts his arm around my shoulder and says, if I have to stay here, so do you. At least I knew I had a job. And I thought that that was one of the most decent things that ever happened.
You worked under Governor Milliken, but you also worked under Governor Blanchard.
That's correct. As a matter of fact, after the election, Governor Blanchard was elected, I did not know Governor Blanchard. I did not work on the campaign. I was working on the Brickley campaign, and he lost to Dick Headley. I'm looking for a job. I have a political appointment. I'm looking for a job. I have a family. I get a call from Jim Blanchard's staff that the governor-elect would like to see me. So I get a one-to-one meeting with the governor-elect. He shakes my hand, and he says, would you like a Coke? And I said, sure. And he hands me a twist-top Coke. And I'm so sweaty, I can't open it. But I do not lose it. I said, excuse me, Governor. I called him. I got up, I got a towel, I opened it up. And he said that you've been highly recommended. I'd like you to stay on as my deputy budget director because I need some transition in terms of what's going on. And I said, I'd be honored to do so. And I was. I was very much honored. The budget director who came in at that time was a gentleman by the name of Phil Jordan. Phil Jordan lasted about 8 months or so and then went on to become the chief of staff for the governor. And the acting director was somebody by the name of Doug Roberts, who really wanted to become director of management and budget. But because of my stint with the Milliken administration, that was just not to be. Okay. And the person who followed the budget director then was a guy named Bob Naftali, very good person, did an excellent job. And so, I mean, I spent a whole year working with the Blanchard administration, but there were some really big stories in that first year.
Well, yeah, you had an income tax increase, a major income tax increase.
There was, and I'd like to go into that because I was there when it happened. You can't talk about Governor Blanchard's income tax without going back 1 year before, in 1982. In 1982, I talked about the economy falling off, talked about all the cuts. Governor Milliken, in his very last year, proposed to the legislature a 1% increase in the income tax. Now, at this time, the world was a little different. You have a Republican governor, you have a Democratic legislature in both the House and the Senate, and the governor is not saying he'd sign it, he's leading. He's going out and saying we have to have a 1% increase in the income tax in order to save the budget. I'm not sure that would happen today, but well, it was very difficult to pass. So the House barely passed it, and the Senate took a long time to pass it. I won't go into all of that. Finally, there was a negotiation of 1% for 6 months, which is the same as 0.5% of 1%. But the point I'm trying to make it's over now. It expires. Now Jim Blanchard comes in. He's got the same budget problem. That income tax increase has expired. That just took care of 82. And he proposes to increase the state income tax from 4.6% to 6.35%, or a 38% increase. Well, this is a big deal. Now, I was in the room. I'm not arguing that I was one of the players. There were others, a big player, but I was in the room because I had numbers. And I must say, I supported the position that if you're going to raise the tax, raise it to what you need a little bit more. You're not going to gain any goodwill by saying, oh no, we'll stop at 5.5%. If you think you need 6.35, go for it. Well, they did. There was a lot of stories about this. This is a big issue because the world changed because of this event, in my opinion. And it affected my life, but I didn't know it. So I'm out trying to help people pass this 38% income tax. And the first thing, it goes to the House of Representatives. Again, I cannot tell you the difference in the world. Gary Owen was Speaker of the House. Gary Owen made it very clear to the Democrats that if a Democrat's on appropriations and doesn't vote for this bill, you're off. If you're a chair of a committee and you don't vote for this bill, you're off. And if you're a member of the caucus and you don't vote for this bill, maybe you ought to find another caucus. It was very clear. So it passes the House with really very tough language. It goes to the Senate, and the Democrats barely have enough votes, except that one of their members, Gil Danello, said absolutely not. He will not vote for it. They don't have the votes to pass it. Then a Republican by the name of Harry DeMassa said, I'll vote for it. Well, it's going to pass by one vote. Now, I know this to be true. I don't remember all the details, but 6 Republican senators went to the Democrats, led by Bill Cederberg, and said, we'll make it bipartisan, but we want some changes. The decision was made, and at the time, I'm not sure that I foresaw, nobody else foresaw what was going to happen. They said, we don't need to negotiate. We got the votes, and we can pass it. And they did. So they passed it with one Republican vote, Harry DeMasso's. It then became a partisan issue. The reason this is so relevant is because none of us even thought about this. There were 2 senators who were recalled, Phil Maston and Dave Sorokin. And there was an election. They were just elected, by the way. They just elected they were both recalled by like 2 and 3 to 1. It was crushed. Now, why is that important? Because then Minority Leader John Engler now becomes Majority Leader John Engler. And of course, part of the rest is now a little bit of history. But that was a very big moment in time.
And one of the reasons why it changed your life is because now Majority Leader John Engler at one point turns to you.
He does.
And
he used Majority Leader John Engler. At this time, I left the Department of Management and Budget and went over to work for the Department of Education. And I worked for the Department of Education for a number of years. Phil Runkle was the superintendent. I aspired to become the acting superintendent when Phil Runkle left. That was not meant to be. So be it. Then I get a call from Dan DeGrow, who says, would you like to become director of the Senate Fiscal Agency? And I said, no, not particularly. And okay. And then a little later, I get a call from John Engler, Majority Leader. He said, Doug, can I talk to you? And I said, Senator, you're the Majority Leader of the Senate. Of course I will talk to you. But is this the same issue that Senator DeGrow talked to me about? And he said, yes. And I said, I haven't changed my mind. He said, I just want to talk to you. Little did I know, for the rest of my life, when John Engler just says, all I want to talk to you, either don't show up or you're going to end up saying yes. All right? And lo and behold, I ended up saying yes, and I became director of the Senate Fiscal Agency. I was there for less than 2 years. The election was coming up. But let me just make a couple quick stories about less than 2 years at that job. First, I had a truly remarkable staff. I mean, a staff that to this day I'm so blessed to have had. And let me just give you an example. My deputy at Senate Fiscal Agency was a gentleman by the name of Gary Olson, who's since passed away. He became director of the Senate Fiscal Agency for 20 years, and in my opinion, the best I ever had.
he was somebody that if he told you something, you could take it to the bank.
He was wonderful. Then my chief economist was somebody by the name of Nick Corey, who is currently the state treasurer. Okay, my education specialist was a lady by the name of Ellen Jeffries. She's currently the director of the Senate Fiscal Agency. Rob Abin handled capital outlay. He went beyond to become a deputy of the Department of Transportation. When you have a staff, they may have been younger, but they were all talented. Man, as a director, all you got to do is go in and say, go forth and prosper. They were wonderful.
And Gary Olson worked for George Montgomery after you left, as
That's
I recall.
correct. I always kidded him that, I had to get there first so he could become director. So because I was always in front of him I was a little older, but he was wonderful. He did a terrific job, and I was very proud to have been part of it. There's another story that I want to tell right now, which is a human interest story that's almost still difficult for me to completely explain, and that is when John Engler was hiring me to become director of the Senate Fiscal Agency. I obviously knew how inside government worked. I obviously knew that the elected officials tell the directors sometimes, this is what I want you to do. I understood. But I said to Senator Engler, I said, look, you're the leader of the Senate. I said, if you want to tell the director of the Senate Fiscal Agency what numbers you want, like make them higher, make them lower, then don't hire me because I won't do that. And he said, no, it's okay. And he never did. You can work for some, to me that was just, again, I'm just a person running an agency of which I saw it happen in the House. I saw it happen elsewhere. And I just told him right up front, if that's what you wanted, I was not your person. And he said, fine. And he never did.
And as you say, you were hired for 2 years shortly before the election of 1990, which surprised everyone, and probably surprised John Engler, that he ended up winning. And what was your job prospects after that?
It was pretty bright because after the election, a gentleman by the name of Jeff McCalvey, who was one of John Engler's, and still was, one of his assistants and on the floor, came to me and said, if the governor were to offer you a job, would you prefer to be director of management and budget or state treasurer? And I said, state treasurer. That job was almost like that's what it was meant to do. It's everything I enjoyed. I had the background for it. Clearly that's what I wanted to do. And so I ultimately was appointed to become the state treasurer. The state treasurer is an absolutely terrific job in so many things. What people in Michigan take for granted but don't understand is state treasurer position in almost the rest of the country, and certainly the entire Midwest, and I mean 15 or 20 states, is an elected position, not an appointed position. In fact, it was elected in Michigan up until the '63 Constitution. All right? So therefore, the position is, I think, much more significant. It is something much closer to the Secretary of Treasury or the President in that you represent the boss, the governor, and you handle a lot of activities. So let me just give one statistic, boring or not. If you take the 15 or 20 state treasurers around in the Midwest, and I'm talking about Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, take their staffs, sum their staffs, and double that number. The staff of the state treasurer of Michigan is bigger.
Really?
My staff was 1,600. Okay? Illinois was 85. North Dakota was 5. Because they really didn't have jobs to do. Because they could be a rival to the governor. They ran for governor. Many of the people that I served with as the state treasurers ultimately went on to become U.S. senators and governors. But in Michigan, you worked for the governor, so he kept sending me stuff. He would reorganize, and I would end up with stuff that just was. I even had a deputy state treasurer involved in K-12 testing when I was the state treasurer. So it gives you it's a completely different job. It's something I thoroughly enjoyed.
And you laid down certain conditions on Senate Majority Leader Engler for being head of the Senate Fiscal Agency. Did you lay down any conditions on Governor-elect Engler on being treasurer?
That's a very insightful question. The answer is I will never, ever, when get quoted as saying a condition. I meant no condition. The one that Senate Fiscal Agency, that was probably a condition. The next statement was not. It was a concern. When I went to meet with then Governor-elect John Engler, and he asked me to become state treasurer, I said to him, not I was going to take it, I wanted it. So I just said, I have a concern. And the concern is that I don't think that the treasurer should raise money for you. And I said, it just seems to me unseemly, that's just for me, to basically call a business, ask them to buy fundraising tickets, and then go audit them. The state treasurer is responsible for $40 to $50 billion of investments in 4 pension funds. Obviously, a lot of people made money in that. It just seemed to me inappropriate that I should call them up and say, buy tickets to the governor's fundraiser. He looked at me and he said very clearly, you wouldn't be any good at it anyway. And And I was privileged to be the treasurer
You could
for
handle money but not raise it, in
That's
other
right.
words.
I was basically, and I was never ever included. And you can check all the logs of John Engler's meetings. Anytime they were meeting on a political issue, particularly raising money or something, I was never included. And we used to have a sheet that would have different people's names on it in terms of who's included in the next meeting. And there was this, and I was almost always included on the sheet, and I was always stricken. I did not go to the political meetings. I did not go to raising money meetings. I did what I was hired to do, which I hope ran well with the Department of Treasury.
Now, while you were treasurer, the event that you are probably best known for occurred. But before we get into that, the 1990s was an unusual time in Michigan for its economy because after so many years of the economy struggling, all of a sudden the economy was ballooning and booming. And one of the things that you personally went after was a AAA credit rating for the
That's
state,
correct.
which, as far as I know, had never had before. Is that correct?
We did have it. It was much earlier on. I mean, it was like in the 60s or something. We had it when we were booming. But we fell quite a bit. And it wasn't anybody's fault we did. And I worked very hard in the rating agencies. And when I left after my first 8 years, we had been raised a number of times in credit rating. We were now up into a couple of rating agencies. We were AA+. That is not AAA. So I want to just continue the story that I left. I want to just jump ahead. I left to go to Washington for 2 years. While in Washington, Mark Murray became the state treasurer, and Governor Engler and Mark Murray were able to convince the rating agencies to go to AAA. I got a personal call from John Engler thanking me for my work. And so we were AAA. And the other issue you've got to remember, we had 6 years in a row in the 90s, 6, in which Michigan's unemployment rate was below the national average. It hadn't happened for 30 years. I don't know if it's happened since. I mean, again, you can say that was the time. I will take it, whatever it is. I'm just proud of that record.
Now, you alluded to a little bit ago the first issue dealing with school finance.
Yes.
And what you are probably best known for is your role in crafting what became Proposal A, which changed school finance dramatically.
I think
But
that's true.
there's a lag point there of 20 years or so dealing with what you first talked about and getting to the July 1993 when the Proposal A adventure all began. And you were part, in many respects, of all of that because you're not only in finance, at one point you were involved in state education.
That's correct. There's one issue that I want to lead with. I feel strongly about it, but it's so interesting. It's the issue of myth or fact. And everyone, if you go out in the street right now, they will say, we have a lottery. And the lottery was always intended to be solely earmarked for education. I'm really sorry, but that's a myth. I was there. Let me just go through my pieces of fact, and then I don't care what people say. The vote took place in May 16th of 1972. I just joined George Montgomery's staff. So they adopted the lottery. What did the language say? The language said the legislature shall be permitted to issue lottery. It didn't say anything about where it went, all right? Then people will say, but the ads said it was that. It's not true. The ads were very clear that the extra money would go to, and they started with K-12, comma, public health, comma, social services, comma, higher ed. It was the general fund. Now here's my evidence that people don't know these people, that's okay. I think it was Public Act 239 of that year. An act was enacted and earmarked all the net proceeds to go to the general fund. They say, well, that just goes to show you government lied. Who are the two people who I would just admired so much? One was the Speaker of the House. His name was Bill Ryan. The other was the governor of the state. His name was Bill Milliken. These people have tremendous reputations and ethics, in my opinion. One, the bill had to pass the House, had to be signed by the governor. They would not have, one, passed the House, or two, signed it if it wasn't what they thought the people were voting for. Later, it became a myth that was intended. Now, I will say this. Later, the legislature gave them some information, but they couldn't take the hit anymore after years and years. So they earmarked all the lottery money for education and then took it out of the general fund because the general fund gave. So that was a shell game. That was a shell game. But up to that point, it was never intended. So enough of that. I just feel strongly, because I remember even when I was working, I tried to explain this, and they just said I was just part of government that was trying to mislead the public. Well, I'm not, and that's my position, and I'm sticking to it.
And the school finance question was always tied up with the question of Michigan's property taxes.
Absolutely.
And we, of course, went through a number of different property tax proposals, the famous Tisch proposal in 1978, which would have created a dramatic cut in property taxes
one in
and
80,
then affected schools.
And another one in 80.
Right.
In 1972, I'm still working for George Montgomery, a Republican governor, Bill Milliken, a Democratic legislature, House and Senate, goes to the public to reduce property taxes and increase the income tax. Okay? And so the first proposal was not the sales tax we always know today, but the first proposal was Bill Milliken and the Democrats went to the public and said, will you support decreasing the property taxes and increase the income tax? Michigan has a flat rate income tax. So there was a second proposal to allow for a graduated income tax. The argument was if the first one passes, they'll cut property taxes and increase the income tax. The second issue, if the second one passes, they'll increase a graduate income tax. One of the biggest problems, and both failed, and the income tax failed quite badly. Income tax failed quite badly. The problem is the people who don't trust government said, so let me get this right. You're going to cut my property taxes today, increase my income tax. What's to stop property taxes coming right back, and I have both? Now, that might have happened over time, but that was a very hard sell. Anyway, both went down. That was 72. In 1980, there was another attempt. Bill Milliken and the Democratic legislature went to the public and had another proposal to decrease property taxes and then this time increase the sales tax. I'm the deputy budget director. I'm out there trying to sell this puppy. Okay? We got 26% yes vote. 26%. Not good in a democracy. However, some of us geniuses, and you're looking at one of them, convinced the governor and some of the legislative leaders that 1980 was a bedsheet ballot in November, meaning numerous items were on, all confusing. You had another Tisch amendment, you had all sorts of things. We said, give us a special election. We'll go out and we'll sell it this time. So the legislature, again, I know people find this strange. You have a Democratic legislature, needs a 2/3 vote, with a Republican governor to go back to the people in a special election. May 1981. Doug Roberts is out there selling this, and now we do a lot better. We go from 26% yes vote to 28%. Maybe we were out of touch. Just maybe. So in 1987, I'm not done just yet. In 1987, I'm the Deputy Superintendent of Public Instruction, and the State Board of Education provides a commission for what's called the Hardin-Runkle Commission. Ed Hardin was the former president of MSU and Northern. Phil Runkle was the superintendent. They had a 36-member commission, and they came up with some very good ideas. I was chief of staff of that commission. So I was very much involved in putting everything together. That was wonderful. The vote was 33-3 to move forward. Unfortunately, not all votes are equal. One of the three was the MEA, and politics stopped it. The reason that's an important story is I put that commission report in my drawer, and I pulled it out later. So in 1989, there was other attempts. It failed. Okay, that's where we're going. The one issue I do want to bring up, however, is that in 1989, Jim Blanchard, who was governor, tried to come up and solve the problem of school finance. And to this day, I give him credit for trying, and I'd like to just explain it. What's the problem with school finance? What are we trying to solve? I mean, if you don't understand that, we have 500 school districts. We have some with very low income and some with very high income. We had great inequity, and it was getting worse. So what's the solution? Well, the solution, two obvious solutions are: one, you cut the spending of high spending districts, not politically going to fly, or you raise enough revenue to raise the lower spending districts up. We all said you can't do that. So in 1989, Jim Blanchard went to the public and said, let's increase the sales tax from 4 to 4.5 cents, earmark the half a penny for schools, and try to bring up the lower. He went right at the issue and said, we could solve it that way. It got absolutely creamed. I went out trying to explain that proposal, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say something not very nice. One of the questions I got every time, and I got tired of answering it, how do you collect a half a penny? Just burned me up. Well, I don't know. How do you collect 4 cents on $1.11? You use you round her up and down, but I got it every time. So I give him credit for that. All right, that's over. Now we have an election. And Jim Blanchard is running against John Engler. I'm now head of the Senate Fiscal Agency. And John Engler is running on the issue of cutting property tax. I mean, that's what he's running on. And 17,000 votes later, he wins. Very unusual, okay? So he starts out by saying, I'm going to cut property taxes. Whoa. The House is Democratic. The Senate is Republican. John Engler's a conservative Republican. Of course, given today's line, I don't know if he's moved into the moderate range or not, but anyways, conservative Republican. And the House wasn't going to give him a property tax cut. It just wasn't going to happen. So the governor collected signatures. We went out to the public. We had something called cut and cap. And I went out to sell it. And it was a 20% cut in property taxes with, we argue that a lot would be made up, but the language didn't guarantee it. So it was a 20% cut basically with no guarantee there was going to be a makeup. It failed, but wait. It failed 41-59. Now, in most democracies, 41-59 is a crush. Every organized group opposed that. And you still got 41%? There was something out there. People were really upset. So that was in 1992. In 1993, John Engler called the MEA. They got together. I helped negotiate the deal. And now we have an agreement between John Engler and the MEA to increase the sales tax and decrease property taxes. Shoot, we've got it covered. We're going to win. We go out and we lose. It was closer. It was 46 or something, 54, but we lose. I'm not sure I can give a good explanation for that.
I remember on that particular election night at the headquarters, and everyone was quite stunned.
I was. We thought we were going to win. Politically, we had all the groups. My explanation after the fact, if I was smart enough, I would. So this is not, I'm being a Monday morning quarterback here, even though I was in there, thought we could do it, is that there were a certain number of, a percentage of the population that didn't want to change anything. They liked what they had. And then, and unfortunately, maybe that was one of the beginnings of a society that we're now living in, is that people really didn't like people. This was the beginning of either distrust or anything you're for, I'm against. There was a number of people who disliked Governor Engler, and if he was for it, they were against it. But wait a minute. There were a number of people who didn't like the MEA, and if they were for it, another group of people were against it. So you put those all together, it failed. And so that was it. We were done. We were not going to pass it again. And that was the end of literally my lead up to Proposal A. The reason that was so important is, with all due respect, I don't think there's anybody in the state that had worked harder, understood more of it, who wasn't in a position to try one more time to get Proposal A right.
And we get now to Proposal A. And as you say, the lead up to that was on that fateful night in July of 1993. Yeah. The Senate was actually prepared to vote on a bill that had passed earlier. It was a certain percentage cut in property taxes.
Senate Bill 1. That's
Senate
correct.
Bill 1. It was passed by the Senate. It was passed by the House, which was an unusual situation because the House was an even split.
That's correct.
The 1992 election resulted in 55 Republicans and 55 Democrats. You had shared power. And it had come back to the Senate to confirm, essentially, the changes the House made. John Cherry, who was the Democratic leader, went out to dinner with Bob Emerson, wrote out in a cocktail napkin a proposal to eliminate all property taxes, handed that to Debbie Stabenow in a caucus meeting. You guys knew about it.
Well, let me tell you, I was in the room. I did not know. You just told me something. I didn't know about who, right? On what cocktail napkin. But I will say where I was and what I can attest to. I'm in the meeting with Governor Engler. At that time, the majority leader was Dick Posthumus, and he came to see the governor, and I'm in the room. And he says, then State Senator Debbie Stabenow is going to make this motion. And the argument's pretty interesting. The argument is that this was a 20% cut in property taxes with basically no guarantee of a makeup. If that's good, then a 100% cut and no makeup should be better. All right? I have a great deal of respect for now U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow. Whatever she says, I saw this as just a political maneuver. That's what I saw it as. And even said so, but it doesn't matter. And their argument, in my opinion, was the Senate would either vote it down or certainly the governor would veto it. Because this is $7 billion in property tax. So, Majority Leader Senator Posthumus says to the governor, Governor, will you sign it? And I remember. Other people can remember differently. He said, that won't happen. They won't make it. And to the Senator Posthumus's credit, he said, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, if it comes to you, will you sign it? And now I'm going to go on too long, but it's important. And the answer is, I thought it was a long time, maybe it wasn't. He said I would sign it. I think there was only one head that hit the desk, and that was mine.
Well, you all of a sudden have got a $7 billion problem.
Exactly. Now, the problem is, I'm a technician, all right? I think I'm a good one. And the answer is, I hope people understood what we just did. Between now and December, we can change our minds and look silly, but we can just say we didn't mean it and get the taxes back. But after December, it was my belief, and still to this day, you have lost $7 billion. You can't make it up. Somebody says, well, you can't make it up. You can raise other taxes. You see, this is where a technician comes in. No, not true. What do you mean not true? We had what was called the Headley Amendment. The Headley Amendment limited the total amount of taxes relative to personal income. However, there was a clause in the Headley Amendment that under emergency situations, you could exceed that. Fine. We're going to need a 2/3 vote to use the emergency clause in the Constitution to double the income tax. Really? I didn't know if we could do it or not. And so, but in any event, within 48 hours, it was the law of the land. We had now abolished property taxes. $7 billion were gone, and we needed a new proposal.
I'm just curious, during that night in the Senate when it was being debated, as a reporter who was there, one of 4 reporters who were there, it was an amazing situation. The public, this was going on, the public had no idea. In fact, the governor held a very quick impromptu press conference at about 10:45 in the evening. One of the local TV stations showed up. I was over in my office getting ready to write up the story. As soon as the TV news came on, every light on my phone lit up with people calling saying what actually just happened. I'm just curious, were you sitting back in whatever little cubbyhole closet, wherever it was you were, during that night of debate saying, please don't pass this, please don't pass this,
No,
please
I didn't. I don't
this?
remember that. I don't remember watching him. You got to understand that if that's what they were going to do, then I guess they were going to do. I will say this: I always had a position that if my first idea doesn't work, I had a backup. I wasn't sure where to go. I mean, this is a very, very major issue, and it was going to be. I just hope they knew what they were doing, and I do believe to this day that you can characterize what happened as one of the first games of Texas Hold'em, which is all in. I mean, we were going to either solve it or we were going to look awfully bad. I don't think most politicians would be willing to play that today.
And it wasn't just Michigan that was looking at it. I remember going to the National Governors Association meeting that took place a few weeks after this. And the governors there were all rather astonished and kept saying, how could you guys do this?
I would never recommend eliminating beforehand. But if I could go in with Proposal A?
Yes, and that raises a very good point because the governor signs the bill at a big ceremony down at Dearborn.
Henry Ford, that's correct.
Henry Ford Museum.
Yes, that's correct.
And he turns to someone to say, come up with a proposal. And that person was?
Governor called me up before then, and he said, I'd like you to lead my team in putting a proposal back together again. And I said to the governor, I want to do this. I have the background, I can do this. And I said, how do you want to proceed? He said, I want a commission. I said, Governor, you can't have a commission. I've done commissions. I've told you the Hardin Runkle Commission. You can't meet in 60 days if that's how much time I had. He said, no, you have 65 days. I said, no, you can't do it in 65 days. And I said to the governor, I tell you what I can do. You give me the best people in state government, I'll give you their names. And we'll do it. We'll work 7 days a week, and I'll make it happen for you. Now, he said, okay. And some of the people that Mark Hilpert was very important. Nick Corey was very important. Mike Antonesio was very important. These were some of the best, in my opinion, the best people in state government. We did work 7 days a week, only about a half a day on Sunday. And we came up with a much more far-reaching report than I think people expected. When we ultimately proposed to the governor, and then he ultimately recommended it to the legislature, with really 3 sections, and people forget this. The first section was school reform. The second section was school finance. And the third section was state and local changes, property tax changes. People forget about that one. So the first one was school reform. That was the beginning of the discussion on schools of choice, charter schools, all sorts of things.
In some respects, it has become historically one of the biggest impacts of Proposal A.
And then the next issue was, how do you put school finance back together again? Listen, this is a very difficult issue, but I learned, and I'm very serious, I learned from the Hardin-Runkle Commission. Because the Hardin-Runkle Commission came up with the key to school finance reform politically. It was a very simple key, but they came up with it, and I just stole it and put it in my drawer and pulled it out. And that is, I went through before that what was the problem with school finance? You had poor districts and rich districts, and you couldn't figure out a way. Well, then don't do it right away. Use time to solve the problem. Keep higher spending districts from running away. That is, give them a little bit of increase, but cap their increase, not their cut, and give any increases going to the lower spending and close the gap over time. And that's exactly what we did. It came from the Hardin-Runkle Commission. It's like I already had a plane tested in the drawer and I just pulled it out. And that's how we came. Now, we talked about a number of issues. I will say this, however. The initial proposal was to, in terms of finance, was nothing in terms of homestead property taxes. We now have 6 for schools, but we didn't have that. When I wrote it, I wrote a 4% transfer tax on property. Well, the real estate industry went ballistic. And so we had to back off, and we needed money. So I said, what's the difference between paying it every year or paying it once when you sell the house? You know, if it's going to be on the house, you want it every year, a little, or do you want a lot at once? And they said, we want a little each year. I said, okay. So we backed off. But the reason that was important in my life is because we recommended in that report the elimination of something called the State Tax Commission, because we were going to eliminate the need for the state to be in the property tax business at all. It'd be all entirely local, and locals would run it in terms. Well, since then, of course, I've ultimately been on the State Tax Commission a long time, so there's a little bit of humor.
You were writing yourself out of a job, is what you're saying.
In terms of that. One issue I want to get on record again, is state and local finance in terms of property taxes. We proposed at that time to locals that they received something called statutory revenue sharing. And we said, not constitutional, statutory revenue sharing, we're going to eliminate it. Ooh, they didn't like that. I said, but we will give you the authority to levy property tax by a vote of the elected officials only, not a vote of the people. That is, if it's a county tax, the county commissioners can vote for it. If it's a city, the city council, the local officials can vote for it. Now, of course, the locals decided they didn't want any part of it. We wanted school finance first, so we dropped it. I'm telling you, it wasn't but a couple of years later the legislature eliminated all of statutory revenue sharing. They had the opportunity and they walked from it. And I just want to remind them for history that we gave them the opportunity and they said, no, why should we be forced to vote for a tax when we get statutory revenue sharing for free? And then they lost it. So in any event, that's in 65 days we put it together. The governor went before a joint session of the legislature. I think it was something like October 5th, and he delivered it. And now I cannot say enough good about what I thought was the best of the legislative process. And I mean that as sincerely as I can. As you pointed out earlier, the legislature, the House was 55-55. I didn't think it would ever work. Paul Hilligans and Curtis Hertel Sr. were the 2 co-speakers. I don't think it ever worked any better. They were two remarkable gentlemen. They ran the House. I didn't think it could work. They just did a terrific job. But when you, with neither party even having a majority, and we're trying to rewrite school finance, and we need a 2/3 vote to put something on the ballot, are you kidding me? This is like impossible. The House appointed a 14-member committee, 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and they worked very hard to try to come up with amendments to our proposal that would make it more palatable to them. The Senate also worked on it. The one issue about some of the ultimate outcomes is obviously we have 6 mills now on homestead property. We didn't have that before. We also have a situation in which people ask me, Doug, why did you write what we now know is called the 5% cap on property tax? That is, taxable value can only go up by 5% or inflation, whichever is less. And the answer is, I didn't write it. We did not propose it. That was part of the legislative adjustments. It was proposed in the House by Karen Willard, a Democrat. It got 77 votes in the House. Remember, there's only 55 Democrats and 55 Republicans. And it was put on. We supported it. I'm not running from it because we thought it would help us pass it, but it wasn't something we proposed. So, I mean, everybody's got a little finger of that in terms of what ultimately went. Now, the Democrats, to their credit, said to the governor, because I was in the room when they came, Governor, as you know, every one of these proposals, which is a sales tax increase and a property tax cut, went down to defeat. What happens in our special election, which is in March, if we go down to defeat? We lost $7 billion in taxes. So they said, we need a backup plan in case you fail. And I wasn't sure we were going to pass. I'm there. I mean, I think Bob Emerson was the state representative at the time, came in, was making a case for the House Democrats, and said we want an income tax as a fallback. Now remember, they really want to pin the income tax on John Engler because of the recalls and everything else. So John Engler's listening, and he says, fine. And they said, now you understand, you have to sign all these bills before the vote. You can't wait to after the vote. He said, yes, I understand. So we're going to sign all the backup bills to both our plan, the constitutional plan, and the backup plan, which was basically a 6% income tax and some other differences. And if one failed, then the other one would become law. Bob Emerson leaves. I look at the governor and I said, why did you agree to that? And he said, because if I can't defeat an income tax with the sales tax, shame on me. And whether you like it or not, we ran against the income tax. Now, we ran against something else. We ran against tobacco. The irony of the tobacco story is almost beyond comprehension.
And for people that don't know, they literally put millions and millions of dollars.
Oh, no, that's absolutely true. But let me tell you how this happened.
Defeat Proposal
That's
A.
correct. But let me tell you how this happened. I was involved at the very beginning. The governor was proposing increase. I wrote it. We're proposing increases of the cigarette tax from 25 cents at that time to 75 cents. It's a big number. Okay? And I remember being in the meeting with Governor Engler and Mike Murphy, who is a professional pro. And I said to the governor, let's drop the cigarette tax proposal. And I said, the tobacco companies are going to spend $4 to $5 million trying to defeat us. It isn't worth this issue. We need to pass Proposal A. Mike Murphy was spot on. He said to the governor, in my presence, he said, Doug's almost right. He said, I've been involved in some of these campaigns in other states. Let them, and we'll run against them. And lo and behold, you have the MEA opposing us, and their sidekick is the tobacco companies. Now, how you maneuvered that is just because the backup proposal was an increase in the cigarette tax from 25 cents to 40 cents. So the tobacco companies preferred that over increasing it to 75 cents. Well, I'm telling you, I never saw something play out that way. They would have an ad. The ad may have even had a point. What would be our response? Well, look who's paying for it, the tobacco companies. And the thing passes 69 to 31. It was a stunning achievement.
The 69 to 31 is what you're talking about when the public actually voted on the proposal in March. But let's not get right there right away.
Sorry.
There's a couple of points to bring up. It was an incredibly intense time.
Yes, it was.
I mean, as a reporter, I was putting in 16, 18-hour days, sometimes more than that. And you had a particular issue going on at the same time, a particular personal issue. I don't want to be too melodramatic about it, but while you were working on Proposal A, you honestly and occasionally thought you were going to die.
I did. And I think it was October. I'm in the middle of this issue, and I am diagnosed with a brain tumor. Now, fortunately, it's not a Senator McCain brain tumor. The doctors, after we weren't sure, because you have an MRI, you have a brain tumor. Not exactly sure. But I went to enough that they were reasonably certain that it was a non-malignant brain tumor, but had to come out because it would affect. But it's slow growing, and so I was going to risk a lot, but we weren't completely sure. And I said, I want to finish this. And so I told my family and I told the governor, but nobody else knew. And so we finished everything we needed to do. And the only time that health issue became at all an item was after the 30-hour session, which was like the day before Christmas. I've been up, I'm really tired, everybody's tired. The governor gives a press conference on what just accomplished, and John Trescott, who's still around, comes to me, and he's handling the governor's press, says, Governor would like you to give a press conference on the details. And I said, no. He said, no. He said, I said, tell the governor, no, I won't do it. I can't do it. And what I was afraid was I couldn't keep it together because I wasn't sure I was coming back.
I remember you telling me once that you felt quite emotional. You really thought that you had accomplished this, and this might be the very last thing you would remember.
Even if you didn't even remember, anytime they start poking around in your skull, it isn't necessarily that you don't come out, but you may not have the job again. You may not be the same person. I mean, anytime they start punching around in there, you don't know what's going to happen. So yeah, I thought this may be the last thing I ever did, and frankly, I was very proud of it. I still am.
And what's astonishing to me is I remember being continually exhausted.
I was.
During this period of time. As a reporter, I can't imagine what you must have been feeling. How did the situation with the tumor, were there times when you thought, screw it, I'm not going to do this anymore? Or did it just say to you, I have to do this, I have to do this?
Yes, it worked exactly the other way. Is that I don't have a second chance. I have to do this. Yeah, no, it was absolutely an encouragement that there is no choice. You're going to do this.
And now, it'll be 25 years this July from that fateful night. How would you assess Proposal A overall?
Let's put it this way. I will give it one thing. I think Proposal A has been enormously successful in this sense. First, schools are open. What do you mean open? People forget, in 1993, just prior to Proposal A, Kalkaska closed. Because people said, well, people won't ever do that. You had to vote school millage. If you could vote yes, you can vote no. And Kalkaska was running out of the money, and they went back to their people 3 times. And the people said no. So they closed. So at a minimum, we're open. What we basically said with Proposal A, the fundamental premise, if you want to, is that every child is entitled to a fixed amount of money whether or not the school district they live in wants to provide that amount. It's called foundation. So everybody got at least that amount. And somebody said, well, that wasn't that big a deal. It's a huge deal. The inequities are much, much closer. Yes, we still have some inequities, and maybe some are arguing that's enough. But there isn't any question about it. I think it's much fairer, and in my opinion, getting more fair. The higher spending districts correctly argue, and they've told me this, Doug, you ruined us. You limited our ability to increase our spending, which we did by Constitution, and that we can't even keep up with inflation. And that is true. So what do you mean? If we allowed the highest spending districts even to go at the rate of inflation, the state never would have had enough money to bring up the lower spending districts. We had to slow them down if we're going to allow the lower spending districts to get closer. And yes, it was a conscious policy decision.
But there's still some aspects of school finance that I know bothered you for a long time. And this gets a little technical, but this gets into school districts being able to raise funds for buildings.
Yes, very important. Yeah, it's called capital outlay. See, what we did not include in Proposal A, and we've thought about it, but we said we were doing the operating millage for schools. We did not include capital outlay because we just thought it was like too big. We had a big enough item to swallow. what capital outlay really does, the reason it's so unfair, even to this day, and no one seems to care, and I can't understand that, but so be it. If you take East Lansing, which, by the way, schools, which is not much different in size than Hazlitt, and East Lansing wants to issue, say, a bond issue. Whatever that bond issue is, the millage rate in East Lansing will be less than half what it is in Hazlitt for the same bond issue for the same number of students, simply because the property value in East Lansing is so much bigger than it is in Hazlitt. That's just not fair. I mean, I just can't quite get why people think, and yet nobody seems to care. So yes, we left that on the table, and I do feel bad about that, but I've even tried a couple of times to come up with ideas to how to address it. It's just that's for another day. But it's unfortunate. We did not address school finance reform. And my defense of what we did adopt in Proposal A is, if you agree with me, and if you don't, I guess it doesn't matter. If you agree with me that the way we finance capital or capital outlay or buildings is unfair, then all you were looking at is that you would have had it for operations as well if we wouldn't have changed it under Proposal A.
And you mentioned a little bit ago that you were gone for a while. Mark Murray was treasurer.
That's correct.
You went to Washington, and you came back.
That's correct.
And the governor asked you to be treasurer again.
That is correct.
And things were starting to change a little bit. We had not yet, but shortly thereafter, we were attacked on September 11th, 2001. We went into a recession. Now you have a different problem that you have to face, one that you're familiar with from earlier times. How did those last couple of years with Governor Engler work?
I was very honored that he asked me to come back. I obviously was excited about joining his team again. Obviously, I did not see what happened in terms of the attack on the World Trade Center. I was off on some sort of conference, and I talked to the governor the day it happened, and he basically said, would you give me a quick review of what you think is going to happen with the economy? And I said, Governor, you don't want my opinion on that. And I said, do you think people are going to buy cars after this? They don't know what's going to happen. Cars are going to tank. And I will say the person who saved us was General Motors. And that's the reason that was the very first time General Motors had interest-free loans, and people went back to buy cars. But it was going to be much worse than it turned out to be. But it was a difficult time, but we worked through it, it was a real privilege to come back for a second run.
And when Governor Engler left, you went to Michigan State University, but that didn't end your time serving governors.
No, I did not. I've been really privileged and honored to continue my service to state government. Governor Engler appointed me to the State Tax Commission, of a position that I to this day hold, which means that Governor Granholm reappointed me and Governor Snyder has reappointed me, so I'm very honored to be having appointments from all of those governors. Also, Governor Engler appointed me to an 8-year term as a member of the Board of Trustees of Northern Michigan University. And so, I mean, I still continue to serve in different capacities. It will end this year. I've just been privileged to end up serving for 5 governors.
I want to bring up a point that you've said many, many times during this interview that you were privileged, you were honored to have worked with different people, to have worked in the positions that you did. You talked earlier on about public service with your father, who started with public service in the Secret Service. That's continued. Your son, John, was budget director.
That's great. Let me, if I could interrupt, this is important. I'm glad you raised it. I'm going to take my last couple of minutes. My brother, I only have a single sibling. My brother was a Navy pilot and flew what was called a P-3 and chased Russian submarines. My son John was a special assistant to George W. Bush and later budget director. My son Doug worked for the legislature and is now an executive with consumers. My stepson Pat is a teacher in East Lansing and a member of the Grand Ledge School Board. My stepson Ryan is an emergency room doctor and also a member of the Michigan Bar. I have 4 wonderful daughter-in-laws, 7 grandchildren. I have a remarkable family. And they all, I mean, a lot of them are carrying on the whole issue of public service.
And why is public service so important to you? I mean, you're a bright guy. You could have gone on to Wall Street or someplace like that, made a ton of money.
You know, the answer is it's a very good question, and I thought I wanted to do that. And when I went to Washington, I worked for a private company. I made more money, and it just didn't seem the same to me. I know this may sound strange and maybe even naive. I really went to work thinking that I could make things better. And that was a very high motivation for me.
And with that as a motivation, when at some point somebody sums up your life, sums up your career, what is it you want them to say?
I was a good public servant.
I think people will say, Doug, that you were a good public servant. Thank you very much for taking the time today. Thank you for inviting us to your home. Thank you again to the James J. Blanchard Living Library for the Michigan Political History Society. We encourage you not only to watch this video, but all the videos that have been provided by the Political History Society. I'm John Lindstrom. Thank you and good night.